Hello everyone, and welcome to this special Fairfax Media Election Google Hangout. I'm Tim Lester at Fairfax Media's headquarters in Sydney. Today, 1 month before we all vote, perhaps our most widely known and unusual candidate has agreed to take questions from a group of ordinary Australians. He is Julian Assange. On September 7th, Victorians will see the name of the 42-year-old WikiLeaks founder on their Senate ballot papers. Never mind that for more than 400 days now he has been in asylum. He joins us tonight, or today, Australian time, from his refuge, the Ecuadorian Embassy in London. Julian Assange, thank you for your time today. It's, I think, about 3:30 a.m. there in the UK now. Are you feeling sparky enough for an election discussion?
Well, we'll see what it's like, Tim. Me and the team here are at 3:30, so I guess we take this business seriously. But you know, I don't get out much, so it's quite nice actually to speak to some Australians directly.
Well, it's a great opportunity for us to directly question you, given your circumstances. Fairfax Media's websites and newspapers called for questions to put to Julian Assange. We have 6 Australians, or 7 in fact, Australians joining the Hangout today, and I will introduce them as the Hangout goes on and they pose their questions. And as well, I have some questions from others who've sent them in to add in along the way. Our first questioner today is an intern and aspiring journalist who has indeed helped contribute to the organisation of this Hangout. She is Lisa Fessenden, and she's in Canberra in Parliament House. Lisa, get us away with the first question.
Hi Julian, my question just goes to the feasibility of your Senate bid. Specifically, if you are to be elected to the Senate and you find yourself in a position to take up that role, how will you manage the workload and energy that is required of a senator with the enormous task of being editor of WikiLeaks? And are you prepared to give up your WikiLeaks work should you be elected?
Interesting question. Am I prepared to give up my WikiLeaks work? If elected, absolutely not. I do not see the work as being substantially different. In fact, that's the beauty of it, that the experiences that I have developed over many years in holding corrupt banks to account, to exposing assassination plots of hundreds of people, to going toe-to-toe with the Pentagon, all of that is in fact the techniques that we need in the Senate. We need effectively to parachute crack investigative journalists into the Senate to understand its complexity, people who are specialized at exposing lies and exposing secret deals. That's exactly what we need in the Senate. And far from being in competition, actually, my work in WikiLeaks gives me an extra ability to perform that role as an Australian Senator.
Russell Hampstead, a paramedic from Shepparton, is also joining us. He, as well, is a Liberal Party member. Russell is calling from his home in Shepparton. And Russell, I know you have a question or two that goes to the circumstances that Julian Assange is in and how that might work.
As you said, I've got quite a few questions for Julian, but I suppose the first one is, Julian, it's been widely claimed that you're avoiding extradition to Sweden not because you are guilty of any crimes there, but because you are afraid that you might then be extradited to the United States. Assuming this is true, and given that the United States has an extradition treaty with Great Britain, which has been described as one-sided in favour of the US, if they were planning to extradite you, why haven't they requested it from the UK in the first place?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It is a particular framing that our opponents try to use. It is complete bullshit. I have been granted political asylum here in the Ecuadorian Embassy in relation to the US case. I'm not afraid of anything. However, my US lawyers, Michael Ratner, President for the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Department of Justice, and Barry, one of our US lawyers, all say that there is an active investigation into me. There is more likely than not a grand jury indictment. It's the front page of the New York Times back in June. In relation to extradition from here, My asylum is in relation to the United States. It's not in relation to Sweden. It's not in relation to the UK. It's in relation to the United States. In terms of ordering, well, the London Independent diplomatic correspondence revealed way back in 2010 that there were already informal talks in relation to Sweden, and that the order of extradition would be from Sweden. There would be otherwise competing extradition requests, and there would have to be a decision here by the Home Secretary to reverse the order. The extradition situation here from the UK is bad. It is also bad from Sweden. If the Swedes dropped their preliminary investigation, like you, I'm also not charged. If they dropped their preliminary investigation tomorrow, it wouldn't make any difference at all. It would be helpful politically, but legally it wouldn't make any difference to the situation here. The big threat is the United States grand jury investigation. Involves over a dozen different US agencies, well published in the US media.
Russell, I know you might have a follow-up.
Yeah, so you've stated to the press that you believe if you're elected to the Senate, it will force the UK to release you in order to avoid an incident. But what's to stop the United States from then requesting extradition from Australia?
Yeah, good question. I didn't say that. I said that it would make it politically difficult for the United States to pursue its grand jury investigation into a full-blown attack on the organisation and indictments and so on. That's a very interesting question. The Australian Extradition Act was modified just a year or so ago. Modifications that all parties let through and should not have let through. That is a significant challenge to Australian sovereignty that makes it easier to extradite people to the United States based upon their political actions as well as of course, other crimes. This is a matter of international geopolitics. There are serious players involved. It's a serious political situation. Whether things are possible politically decides the outcome for extraditions. There's a great statement by McNabb, a very famous international extradition lawyer, that the dirty secret about extradition is that 10% law and 90% politics. So if there is sufficient political will to protect our staff, me included, in Australia from extradition to the United States, then there will be no extradition. If there is not sufficient political will, then there will be extraditions.
Julian, I know you've skirted around this topic a little bit, but a great many people who wrote in questions or sent them in have an interest in it, and perhaps they were most bluntly summed up by one unnamed contributor who asks, how the hell are you going to get out of the embassy? Can you add any detail to that you've already given us?
Well, I came into the embassy with a purpose, to apply for political asylum. Any future actions against our organisation, against my publishing organisation, take place in the context of a state having made a formal assessment and granting political asylum. That brought in the region of Latin America. And we also saw this very concretely with the recent situation with Edward Snowden. As a defender of my human rights, as a group that understands about US interference, having seen it extensively through a series of US coups and dictatorships through the 70s and 80s. So it's not a matter of getting out. It's a matter of protecting my organization, protecting my work, and protecting myself using the best geopolitical instruments that are available. Of course, there are a number of different, under international law, the UK should be granting safe passage. That's the law. They're a signatory to the UNHCR, and it should proceed. They're in violation. There are a number of ways to deal with those violations, but they take time.
Another with an interest in this area of your particular circumstances at the moment who joins us today is Linton Reid. He's a 54-year-old software developer from Melbourne. Linton, your question?
Yeah, hello, Julian. I had a couple of questions, but the one Tim's referring to is, my question is about the consular support that's been, or hasn't been, offered to you by the Australian government, and basically what would you like to see happen to improve support for whistleblowers in the future? I know recently an act was passed a month or so ago called the Public Interest Disclosure Bill, and I think in the US there was something about Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, but these just seem like protecting government officials from being exposed to getting in trouble for whistleblowing rather than people like yourself. So if you're elected to the Senate, what measures would you try and put in place to help whistleblowers, and what sort of additional consular support would you offer? And in fact, what could Bob Carr do now, even though he doesn't seem to want to do anything? What could he realistically do to try and get you back in time for the election?
Well, quite a lot of questions there, so I'll try and be fast. The Whistleblower Protection Bill that recently passed, that is a step forward. My co-author for many years, Sulette Dreyfus, was one of the principal people involved in developing that bill. Big problem with it. It's been gutted from the most serious component by the ALP. What is that? Well, this doesn't cover national security at all. It doesn't cover the most serious thing in a state, which is those mechanisms of coercive force that maintain its military, its alliances elsewhere, and so on. There's no reason why, for example, the CIA is susceptible to the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, but ASIO isn't here. That's completely absurd. What Australian intelligence institutions are incapable of that oversight, the US institutions are. Similarly, when we look at Australians overseas, now the way that Bob Carr has dealt with me, and the way that Kevin Rudd, when he was Foreign Minister, dealt with me, yes, of course, that was an embarrassment. They did nothing at all. They were scared about offending their mates in the United States. But that's not much different to how other Australians are treated when they get into political situations. The answer is routinely. DFAT treats Australians in trouble overseas in an appalling manner, absolutely appalling, constant spin. They do nothing. They collect lots of information for themselves. They don't pass it on to the people in difficulties. They use those as press lines to brief the minister, so he can look like he is concerned about us. They are not concerned about Australians. They're foreign ministers historically from the ALP and the Conservatives get into a position where they're constantly dealing with their equivalents in the United States, UK, and other countries, and senior bureaucrats in Canberra. And that's what they become interested in, keeping those networks alive and kicking. We dealt with a situation in Egypt where an Australian journalist was stuck there for 9 months. Says exactly the same thing, that there was very little help. Eventually we managed to campaign to get it up to a situation where Carr was forced to intervene, and he was taken out. He's now living in Ecuador with his new wife. In relation to bills for whistleblowers, well, we have a lot of experience with that. I even created a bill for Iceland to try and revitalise the Iceland economy, to protect whistleblowers and protect freedom of speech there. So we have some experience in dealing with that. We would seek to, of course, widen the Whistleblower Protection Act to include national security and a number of other measures.
Elaine Coe is a Year 12 student who joins us from Melbourne, of particular relevance because this federal election will be the first in which she votes, and of course Julian Assange will be on her Senate ballot paper. Elaine, I know you've got a question with regards to information in the modern age.
Hi, Julian. My question is, has government control of the internet now gotten to the point where it can no longer be used reliably to conduct private discussions, at least without enormously elaborate encryption methods, in your opinion?
Yeah, an extremely serious situation, Elaine. Looking forward in the long term, and perhaps the term isn't that long, looking forward 5-10 years, where are we headed? Where are we headed as an Australian society, as an international Western society? Are we headed, in fact, to a dystopia because there's a lot of signs that that is on the cards. We have a transnational surveillance state, and all the communications between nearly every communication between individuals, personal, professional, business, bureaucratic, are all sucked up, hoovered up, and stored in vast, completely unaccountable surveillance apparatuses and shared with their friends and cronyistic businesses. The National Security Agency's budget in the United States, nearly 80% now, it goes to private contractors like Booz Allen Hamilton, Lockheed Martin, SAIC, CSC. These organizations have no oversight. They do not enter into the Inspector General of Intelligence. They're not susceptible to the Freedom of Information Act. Same thing here in Australia. So we really are creating a situation of the information haves and the information have-nots. That collection of information about Australians and others is the greatest theft that has ever occurred, the greatest transfer of knowledge from one group to another that has ever occurred. So it's extremely serious. There are some legislative mechanisms that can help a little bit, but it's mainly, I think, going to be a task of states taking interception seriously, organizations taking it seriously, protecting their people, protecting their users. The development of cryptography that I have been pushing for the past 20 years, and you can read all about that in my book, Cypherpunks, to protect the integrity and privacy and of individuals and the sovereignty of states from domination by these large players.
Another of our Australians joining the Hangout today, I know, has a special interest in your views, Julian, on some of the information questions. Sam Roggeveen is editor of The Interpreter, foreign policy blog at the Lowy Institute, which is based here in Sydney. Sam joins us from Sydney. Sam, your question?
Thanks, Tim. Julian, I'm interested in some of your past views about the nature of government. You've written about it in the past as a kind of conspiracy, and that leaks are actually a method to try to disrupt that conspiracy. You said, I think, that it wasn't so much the leaks themselves that do the damage, but the overreaction to the leaks, which force governments into ever higher levels of secrecy, and that effectively gums up the working of government. I just want to know, do you still believe that, and is that a sort of viable philosophy for a political party that aims for power in the Senate?
Well, thank you, whoever that was from the Lowy Institute. As some of you may know, some of you may not, the director of the Lowy Institute, I can't remember his name, like Love something, full of love, I think there are other expressions that are often used, has been an absurd vocal opponent of me on Twitter, but okay. What you're talking about is actually a very interesting analysis. It was an email discussion that I had in 2006, looking at the situation that if you expose wrongdoing and corrupt behaviour by major corporations and governments, will they just take everything off paper? Will they try and get away with it like that? And can they actually do that? Well, actually, it's not so easy. In order for there to be systematic injustice, there must be systematization. In order for there to be injustice at scale, there must be systematization. For there to be systematization, there has to be a paper trail, there have to be emails and so on. Otherwise, the people working at the coalface in these organizations don't do what they're told. You have Chinese whispers, and abusive orders start to decay. We saw that when we released the main manuals for Guantanamo Bay. Extraordinarily, in those manuals was a description to conceal information from the Red Cross, to fake what was going on, to hold people in their first month, regardless of their innocence or not, in the most abusive and torturous conditions. Incredible that the United States government was instructing people to commit fraud, to fabricate papers in that sort of situation in relation to the Red Cross. Why in God's name would they put that on paper? Well, the answer is they needed to systematize the injustice. By systematizing the injustice, they enabled us to expose it. So abusive organizations simply have two choices in a regime of transparency. Choice one is they can engage in systematized injustice and as a result be exposed, and as a result of that exposure be diminished in their political capital. Choice 2 is they can take what they're doing off paper, and as a result, being taken off paper, their orders to each other, the cohesive structure, starts to decay, and therefore they can be diminished in their ability to affect the world in an abusive manner. Those are the only two choices. So there's a third choice, which everyone should go to, which is transforming their organization into an organization which doesn't have these problems because it doesn't have abusive plans in the first place. It is not engaged in systematized injustice and doesn't try to. So that was that analysis. I think it is an interesting, important analysis. I don't think it is as you described, and I understand the intent of the Lowy Institute in this affair.
Well, can I follow up?
Please,
just to note, my views are my own, just like everybody else at the Lowy Institute, and we actually staged a pretty thorough debate on the blog that I edit about WikiLeaks, and I actually wrote in support of WikiLeaks at the time. But you know, it seemed to me a reasonable question to get your views on. You know, how you think government functions, and if you think that there is systematized injustice in Australian politics, then you know, how do you aim? Should your party become a force in the Senate to actually do something about that?
There is systematized injustice in Australian politics. There's certainly in the outsourcing to companies like Serco and G4 in relation to the Australian prison system is not that different from what I've been talking about. The systematized decision to keep Australian journalists away from detention centres, away from Australian prisons, that's quite a clear, intentional, deliberate move to remove the scrutiny that the press can bring to the situation. In the Australian Senate, of course, I have the opportunity, and our other senators would have the opportunity to deal with some of the more egregious threats on the press as a result of parliamentary privilege, but also to introduce, and I don't want to overstate the abilities of a minor party to do this, but to occasionally introduce legislation or to modify the government's legislation to enable Australians to communicate the truth more easily through whistleblowing legislation, through protecting the press, and through increased media diversity.
But it seems like WikiLeaks has always been. I mean, it's never been a reformist sort of idea, has it? It's always been disruptive, I guess, at its core, and even revolutionary in its intent. But the whole idea of a WikiLeaks party actually joining in the political process suggests that line has softened.
We've never had a line, as you described. We've had principles that are being stated over a long period of time. Those principles are, if we can compare secretive organizations, secretive societies, we all know that where there is no outside accountability, no scrutiny, unjust plans are developed, and in fact, stupid plans are also developed and brought to fruition and implemented. If there is scrutiny, as soon as possible, as early as possible in the planning process, it allows those who are affected by unjust plans to start to formulate action and take a response to them. That has always been our position. It's a very simple position. It's the position of the American Revolution of James Madison, the Bill of Rights. It's the position going back to the European Enlightenment, and even going back to some aspects of ancient Greece. It's a basic democratic position that information is the lifeblood of democracy. Some people see that as revolutionary, and you should think hard about the people who see it in that way. It's what should always be done, always, with, I suppose, this minor exceptions, but nearly always that is something that should take place. I think if that is done right, in Australia and other countries, there is a substantial ability to move governmental and bureaucratic systems into a more just state. We have done that. Other media organisations have done that in many different cases. I don't want to overstate the ability to do that, but so far, I think it's the best tool that we have available, that anyone has demonstrated that we have available to move towards making systems of government and corporate interaction more accountable.
You're watching a Fairfax Media Google Hangout, special pre-election discussion with Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder and Senate candidate in Victoria on the September 7th election. Dave Baker is another who joins us. He's a 38-year-old from Sydney. He's the strategy director at web content company Made with Ed. He says he's thinking of voting for WikiLeaks, might make up his mind in the next few minutes, and he has a question on the free flow of information. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And thanks, Julian. WikiLeaks is obviously based on the ideal of a free flow of information. But I'm interested as to where you might draw the line on information openness, particularly in terms of, say, international trade or domestic justice issues or even foreign policy that often require a degree of secrecy to be effective.
Yeah, well, I think, I look at this through two lenses. One is, let's imagine, my training is as a physicist, so in physics we try and extremize a phenomenon to understand it, looking at one end and the other. Let's imagine that there was no communication between human beings at all, as individuals, as organizations, as a society. Well, we would keep doing a dumb thing over and over again. And we'd never learn from each other. We would never learn from our mistakes. We'd never learn from our successes. We wouldn't be able to cooperate. We would always be essentially in competition. So that's at one extreme. There's the position we have when the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press was developed, and when writing systems were developed, and we can move forward and understand that the more true information that we have about each other and our environment, and the better we can communicate, the more we develop into a situation where we don't just do the dumb thing again, but where we learn from each other and we are able to build interesting structures as a civilization from that. Okay. Now,
Julian, we are taking questions from Twitter today, and among those to send in a question is Jay Peer, who asks, what is your take on the new refugee policy, considering you are a refugee? I gather Jay is referring to the Rudd government's decision to send all asylum seekers, even before their refugee status is established, to Papua New Guinea or Nauru, and a similar accent on offshore processing from the coalition. Your views?
Sorry, I'm still getting over the shock of the last question. All right. So, the views on the PNG solution. Okay. Well, look, for every complex problem, like refugees, there is a simple solution which is dead wrong, because it's too simple. Now, the PNG solution provides an easy soundbite. It's an easy description. It's sort of a theatrical sort of thing. Similarly, Abbott's absurd G.I. Joe Hollywoodization and co-option of the Australian military for an election campaign. Very serious business, the Australian military should not be co-opted to do things like that. That's going nowhere as well. I have here with me here in exile Benny Wenda, who's the former revolutionary leader of West Papua. There are 9,000 West Papuan refugees in PNG. We can't have the situation where we are taking people like Edward Snowden. If Edward Snowden, he has difficulty flying, he gets on a boat, what are we going to do? Dump him on the streets of Manu Island or Port Moresby? I mean, it's dangerous and it's not terribly bright, the solution. I don't say that there should be only onshore processing or things like that. This is a complex problem. It needs to be addressed predominantly at the source. By dealing with supply and demand, we need some form of offshore processing as well. But a simple solution that is also dead wrong will embroil Australia for years and years and years. You know, how is the PNG economy going to absorb those people? It is a high violence rate. Its economy is not such that it can easily absorb people. Its society, its language system. We are creating a small section of a garrison state that we are going to have to upkeep for 20 or 30 years, paying for that, paying for the race problems, paying for the linguistic problems, paying for the economic problems, because these people can't possibly get work in PNG. That's not an intelligent solution.
Now, one of those who joins us today in our panel of 7 Australians is indeed came to the country as a refugee. Peter Kazimian is a 35-year-old systems engineer from Sydney. He's calling from a friend's place in West Ryde because that has better internet connection, I think. So take it away, Peter.
Good morning, Julian. Some of the you already addressed some of the things that I wanted to ask regarding what your views on the whole refugee status and so on is. What I'm wondering about is, has there been any views that you had before?
I'm sorry, you sound like a drunken goldfish at the moment.
Hi, can you hear me?
I'm sure. We'll just try once more to see if we can get your audio nice and loud and clear. Peter, go ahead one more time.
Hi, is this clear now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, good. What I'm wondering is,
You're back to the drunken goldfish again.
Yeah, Peter, we'll correct that audio problem as quickly as we can and come back to you. Sure. I think I know another who is keen to talk in this area or ask a question in this area is Lisa Vincenten. Lisa? Lisa, you there?
Yes, sorry Tim, just had a mic problem. Julian, you expressed the view that you were against the Papua New Guinea solution and the Nauru solution, and that you were in favour of perhaps some offshore processing. If you had the opportunity as well, would you be in favour of increasing Australia's intake of refugees? And how wide, I guess, would you envision opening, I guess, the so-called gates?
Yeah, well, I'm against the simplified PNG solution.
Right.
Our candidate Kelly Tranter in New South Wales has done extensive work on looking at all these refugee issues and combination offshore, onshore, reducing supply, dealing with demand, etc. There are complex solutions to this that are right. The PNG solution is not a solution. It's a PNG error. It's a PNG fantasy that will leave us laden dealing with these refugees in as economic parlous state in PNG for years and years. So your question about what combination of onshore, offshore, etc. Processing. Well, there needs to be flexibility in the system. There cannot be a case where we see 1,000 refugees dying at sea, obviously. I think equally, precisely like the PNG solution is simplistic and foolish. The green solution is also simplistic and foolish, having only onshore processing. This is a situation that has supply and demand factors, and they need to be dealt with principally at the source. I am a political refugee, formerly a political refugee. Edward Snowden is a political refugee. Both of us have formal asylum. Most political refugees are, in fact, those people who were active in their community, they tend to be middle class, tend to be well educated. So these people are not to be demonized. In fact, these people are often precisely the sort of people that we want in Australia. I know there are problems in many cases, but in other cases, these are exactly the sort of people. So we need to deal with some of those supply issues by, yes, increasing some part of the intake, taking people before they get onto boats, taking them at the earliest possible opportunity.
Perhaps before we leave this topic, Julian, we might try Peter one more time. Peter, have you managed to correct that mic?
I hope so, Tim. Can you hear me clearly now?
A little, maybe not. I think we might do a little bit more work on that. The mic's giving us a bit of grief there, Peter. So let's move on to another topic. We will come back to you as soon as we can clear it up. On the US alliance, and I know you started to go to this topic, Julian, but Diarmid Bartlett from the Gold Coast asks, what are your views about the effect of the Australia-US alliance on Australia's sovereignty, and what would you do as a senator to shape a more sovereign, self-determined future for Australia?
Well, the US alliance since 1947 has been an important part of Australian security early on. Now it is overstepping the mark in a very, very serious way, where we see intense interconnections between the Australian military, Australian intelligence system, where we have to unfortunately start questioning, are our intelligence assets and military assets really working for the Australian people, or are they working for that extended, broader network connection? We shouldn't have to make that question. We now have US troops stationed permanently in Darwin. We find out about US fighter jet flights out of Darwin, US bomber flights out of Darwin, and not from the Australian Parliament, not from the Prime Minister. We find out about that from US magazines. That is completely, utterly unacceptable. The Australian military has the most important task in Australia, and the Australian intelligence agencies are related to it, which is protecting the sovereignty of Australia to make sure that Australian sovereignty is not compromised. But Australian sovereignty is being compromised. It is being compromised as a result of influence from the United States and overseas corporations and so on, through our politicians, through liaison arrangements. The Australian government, WikiLeaks, the publisher, is an Australian organisation. It is an Australian success story. It has a lot of Australian staff, including me. The Australian government sent information about Australians. It's there in Fairfax FOIs that have come out, back and forth to US intelligence agencies. That's not acceptable. It's not acceptable for the Australian government. That is not protecting Australian sovereignty. That is violating Australian sovereignty. In many of the cables that have come out, we've seen how the US Labour attaché at the US Embassy has compromised Australian politicians, marketed, quoted as being a long-term US Embassy source throughout his political rise. Bob Carr, compromised in the 1970s. Bob Hawke, compromised in the 1970s. Very clear documentation that we have republished in Fairfax. The United States compromises Australian sovereignty. Special deals in relation to the US pollution on the Great Barrier Reef, where the US is told, well, those laws that Australia passed about ships polluting Great Barrier Reef, don't worry, we're not going to apply them to US ships. But we're going to have selective enforcement. That's a compromise of Australian sovereignty.
Yeah, I know another...
Australian military intelligence are very important. I like, to some degree, the basis of intelligence organization has the word intelligence. It's about understanding. Right? The German intelligence organization is Federal News Service. It's about understanding the world. At least it should be. But in secrecy, all sorts of bad things happen. Bad alliances develop. And that is a problem in Australia.
I know another with an interest in this area, Julian, is Linton Reid, our software developer from Melbourne today. Linton?
Am I on? Yeah.
You are, Linton, yes.
Yeah, my question was just simply, I've seen you say a lot about how you dislike the Australian-US alliance with and the government's sort of bootlicking approach to, the US says something and we say, how high, sir? But a lot of people would see it as a necessary evil. What sort of future relationship with the US would you pursue? Or would you even wish to scrap it entirely and focus on our Asian neighbours instead?
Our regional security alliances are very important. We should have as many allies as possible. We should have, where the public is aware of it, as many alliances as possible. And the US should be a factor in our alliances, so should Europe, so should the region. The problem is making sure it is an alliance based on respect, making sure it is an alliance based on dignity. The US can have its base in Darwin when we have our base in Florida. That's the sort of respect and dignity that must underpin the relationship that we have with the United States. At the moment, we see Australian politicians engage in a process where the United States knows more about Australian politics than Australian population does. And that's not right. It knows about serious Australian plans for engagements with the United States before the Australian population does. That's not right.
Julian, I know Russell Hampstead, who we spoke with earlier, has a question on the breadth of WikiLeaks policies at this election. Russell?
Yeah, Julian, your WikiLeaks party is just like the Greens campaigning on holding the government to greater accountability. But I had a look at your website and it only discusses 3 very vague policy platforms. How can we trust you to hold the government accountable when you won't even tell us what your beliefs and values are?
Well, look, we must keep things in perspective. WikiLeaks is a party of the Senate. It is an insurance policy in this election. On the one hand, we're going to get the ALP back again as government. On the other hand, we'll have the coalition as government. A disaster would be if both of those organisations either of those organisations had control of the Senate. It would be an absolute disaster. So we must have a situation where there is some scrutiny of their behaviour. We know what they're like. We know what they're like over extensive periods of seeing that all Australians know what they're like. That they lie, they cheat, they favour their network connections, that the Libs are into satisfying big business, that the ALP is into satisfying its connections with property developers, the Macquarie Bank, and its relationship with the United States. So they must be scrutinised. We are not a party of government. We are a party of oversight. That means it is, we can't just invent fantasy policies from the sky and have anyone seriously expect that we'll be in government and so we can implement them. We have important policies, and more policies will be produced over time. And those policies are directed, apart from some controversial issues in Australian politics where we have to make a statement, they are directed about applying methods of transparency that we have developed in the field of investigative journalism, essentially, and applying them to the behaviour of the Australian government.
Julian, given what you say about WikiLeaks being a party of oversight, if Tony Abbott is elected and does as he says he will, seeks to scrap the carbon tax one and the market-based system to price carbon that Labor has implemented, what would you do in the Senate? Would you respect his mandate in the lower house and let him scrap the tax and the market-based system for pricing carbon, or would you fight it and seek to keep the carbon pricing in place?
Look, there needs to be changes to the system as it currently stands. But we're not open for special deals to mining industry mates or open slather. That has got to stop. There is 80% of Australian profits from the mining industry are sent overseas that, without any taxation. That is completely, utterly unacceptable. That sort of thing should be allowed to happen. Similarly, that fat cats in the mining industry have too much influence on the behaviour of the Australian government. That's got to stop. But there shouldn't be a tax, a special tax on productive industry. That sort of attack is also wrong. We need to protect Australian resources and have Australian resources priced the right way. When Australian resources are depleted, that's part of the Commonwealth of all Australians that is being depleted, but the profits are going to a select few. So there has to be proper pricing of Australian resources. There has to be proper scrutiny and accountability of deals the Australian government is doing in relation to those resources, in relation to ETS and so on. We have put out our position about which platform we think will have it's most likely to succeed. It is a complex area. We would say in relation to the proposal by Abbott to simply scrap that system, we would not accept simply scrapping. There must be alternative accountability mechanisms and alternative payment mechanisms that are provided. There can't just simply be an idiotic scrapping of such policy.
Student Elaine Coe in Melbourne has another question for you, Julian.
Hi, Julian. What is your take on the Australian government's recent $2.3 billion cut to university funding?
Education in Australia is very important. Education in Australia is an Australian export success story. We are educating a very important contribution segment of Asian society. That is not just important for Australians earning income on that or the development of the Australian university sector. It's also important for the security of Australia. That the broader Asian region has sons and daughters who are educated in Australia, who are staying in Australia, who are involved in export businesses in Australia. If we are also to have a clever country in terms of its politics, in terms of its structuring, in terms of its arrangements with other countries, in terms of its domestic industry, we need to have an educated country. So the party has not yet issued a formal policy position, so I don't want to eclipse them. But I think education is extremely important. Well, WikiLeaks does, but what I have done nearly through all my life's work is to try and educate people. Now, this Google Hangout is a part of adult education. The knowledge flow system that Australia has defines its political possibilities, defines its technological possibilities, defines even to a degree its business opportunities. So education is very important.
Peter Kazimian, we'd like to bring you into the discussion if we can. Be keen to check your mic and see whether you're right for a question.
Hi, can you hear me fine now?
Yeah, hear you good, I think.
Three times the charm. Hi Julian, and I apologize for the previous issues. I have one of the questions that I basically asked myself when I was in your situation in asylum, and basically when we came here, was this is a life-defining moment for you. There's absolutely no doubt about it, or a life-altering moment for you. If and when you look back at this situation about 20 or 30 years' time, do you think the impact of your plight will be anything...
Drunken goldfish again.
Peter, we're having real trouble with that mic, and our apologies. I think I can paraphrase your question to say that Peter is asking you, I think, Julian, that this is while you are in asylum in London, is a life-defining moment. How do you expect you will look back on this time in 20 or 30 years, and how important do you think you will judge it to have been?
Well, as a publisher that's dealt with very serious matters involving assassinations, the fates of states, elections, revolutions, I have been in a lot of these sorts of things. I have friends and people I owe a duty of care with too, in prison. Quite a number of our supporters in prison or facing uncertain situations. So the present situation, I mean, it's of strategic assistance to us as a publisher. Obviously, I have a personal issue involved, with issues in relation to my family that make the current situation somewhat difficult. But if we look at the trajectory occurring in the United States, in Australia, in the UK, even in Sweden, other supportive countries like India and the Middle East, I think the trajectory is actually quite positive in relationship to me, in relationship to my work. That's something that's been very heartening, and I know that I will look back on my actions and the actions of other people involved with us as an organisation, and I'm confident that I will continue to be proud of those actions.
I know Linton Reid has another policy-related question, probably on the National Broadband Network. Linton.
Oh yeah, I was just curious to know. This might be a bit rhetorical, really, but I was curious to know what you thought of the both the Labor and the Coalition plans for the National Broadband Network. I'm tipping you would prefer a better one than a worse one.
I prefer a much better one. I prefer a much less bureaucratic one. It's very important that we not feed. We understand what a natural monopoly is. A natural monopoly is, for example, land or cable ducts and so on, and that natural monopolies are not put into the hands of private corporations in such a way where they can exploit that monopoly status. On the other hand, the plans by both the ALP and the Coalition for the NBN, I don't think are sophisticated enough. I think it is important that the Australian government take responsibility for the quality of Australian internet, and the freedom on Australian internet, its relative levels of censorship and so on. I think it's important that the Australian government say all Australians must have the ability to have a fast internet that is affordable to them. But the NBN plans by both parties, I do not think reflect the underlying complexities and need for diversity in the Australian internet market.
Julian, Ian Robson has sent in a question, asks whether compared to the United States and the UK, how influential do you think Rupert Murdoch is over media in Australia, and how can the public use new media to reduce his influence?
Well, it's not just Murdoch's influence. He is for sure the largest single player in Australia. Over 60% of Australian print dailies owned or controlled by the Murdoch News Corporation. That's a problem for Australian politics, for the sophistication and richness of Australian politics to have any play with that much control. But 98% of Australian print media is owned, in fact, by just 3 corporations, Fairfax being one of the others. That's a serious problem. Unfortunately, the internet is starting to break up some of that monopolies. We have great organisations like Crikey Online and the Monthly and the Conversation, which is Australian universities putting things together. We have WikiLeaks. We have other, even The Guardian now, starting to publish in Australia. So there is a developing diversity in the environment, but we need a lot more. And the WikiLeaks party has issued a platform which we will fight hard for in the Australian Senate to try and make it so that every Australian, as an individual content provider on the internet, has some way to actually remunerate themselves and be subsidised by it, and journalists as well. And that's taking the rather successful Australian print lending scheme, where Australian authors get just under $1 for each time their book is borrowed from an Australian library, and take the same system, spread it out, apply it to the internet as a whole. So anyone writing a blog, anyone doing a video post, if it's popular by Australian readers, they will be subsidised in proportion to the degree of popularity over the last year. I think that's an extremely important thing for the richness and diversity of Australian society, to boost up investigative journalism and other forms of journalism, and even for the defence of Australia. If we have good quality Australian content available to the world, that makes the world interested and concerned about Australia, including in the most serious of situations.
As we move close to the end of this Fairfax Media Google Hangout, perhaps some closing questions. Dave Bather, anything else you'd like to put to Julian before we wrap up?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I guess that I'm interested in, WikiLeaks is obviously all about changing the status quo. It's also it's operating on some very high ideal policy platforms. But you're going to need a fair degree of mainstream mums and dads support. I'm just interested to see what you think is the way that you'd be able to attract those mainstream voters.
Well, I think by not lying to them for a start, I think that would actually be a significant improvement on the way things are currently done in Australian politics. It's amazing, this election. The prices for registration of a political party, etc., have doubled. Despite that, there is double the number of parties since last election. Why is that? Well, it's because of the incredible disaffection with the Labour and Liberal Party and the National Party to a degree. That disaffection, where does it come from? It's extremely interesting. Yes, perhaps to some extent the parties, the two major parties, are behaving in a disgraceful manner, perhaps even more disgraceful than they usually do. But it's not just about that. This is the period of the greatest political education that Australia has ever seen, in fact that the world has ever seen, as a result of the internet. What we're doing right now is a reflection of that. What WikiLeaks does in its work is a reflection of that. So Australians are simply becoming so incredibly educated that they are able to understand and see through the bullshit in a way that they never did before. And as an organisation that has been on the forefront of doing that, and as a person who was involved in bringing the internet to Australia to educate Australians, I think that there is an understanding that my ideals are extremely clear, that what I believe in is very clear, that I am uncompromising in relation to those ideals, even to the degree that I'm willing to risk my liberty and my life, that of my publishing organisation as well. So that's the sort of person you want in the Senate. I think Australians understand that. If we look at other situations across the world where you see dissidents who have stood for their principles and stood for their ideals in the face of significant intimidation, those people are favoured by the population, and not because they're necessarily the best people on earth, but it's very clear that they are uncompromising in what they do.
But how about for the less idealistic voter, the person who's just wanting to deal with simple domestic issues such as education?
I don't think it's a matter of ideology. What you want for someone in the Senate is someone who's not going to bullshit to you, that is going to see through the lies of others, that is capable of understanding the complexities of the place that you put them in. It's not I think Australians well past these simple bribes by the major parties. Oh, we're going to cut your taxes to whatever. Oh, we're going to crack down on this group or that group. Why are they past that? Well, because they know that the politicians lie. You know, that those promises are not kept once they're in Parliament. So I don't think that as a party that we should be putting out messages that are like the mainstream parties, simple bribes that will not be believed. But you know, as an individual, I haven't just been an activist. We have a broad range of people, candidates in this election. But I've also started a number of businesses, a number of organisations, a number of small businesses in very difficult environments. So I understand what it is like to be a father, to start small businesses, to have problems of many different kinds. So I think Australians can relate to that sort of character, even though I am in a very unusual position, for sure. But I've also had the life experiences that many Australians have had.
Julian, one viewer asks us to ask you, will you candidly address the issue of the accusations of sexual misconduct that have been levelled against you and describe your version of events before the coming election?
Well, look, we have nothing to hide. In fact, you can go to justiceforassange.com and read extensive information about that case. Like you, I haven't been charged. It's an extraordinary situation that someone could be detained for 3 years without charge. That's part of the abuses in this case. It's not, I should not engage in, unfortunately, to a degree, I am an Australian, and therefore Australian men don't like talking about their private life. They don't like saying bad things about their lovers. I'm not going to do that. I don't think this is the appropriate forum. But you can read all about the matter at justiceforassange.com.
Closing questions. Sam Roggeveen, any other questions for Julian Assange?
Actually, I want to pass on a question from one of our readers. Julian, how real is cyber warfare, and where does it rank in terms of security issues that impact on states and on people?
Let's not be silly. It's, with some rare exceptions, maybe with what the United States did with the Iranian nuclear program. It's not warfare. It is spying, extensive spying. The country involved in the most of it, in fact, it covers the entire world. Many Australians are compromised by using Google, Microsoft, Skype, Apple computers, all feeding into that system, publicly revealed in the press. That's real. That's very, very significant. That is a threat to Australian democracy. It is a threat to Australian sovereignty. It is a threat to United States democracy. In relation to other states, will they see the lead, if you want to call it that, taken by the United States? Russia and China have actually asked for treaties to say that computers, for example, that are sold can't have special backdoors in them. The United States refuses to agree in that. So, yeah, there's a developing arms race that we must understand who is leading this arms race and who is way, way, way out ahead. It is the United States. It is the Five Eyes Alliance. Australia runs the risk of compromising its relationships. That's what my insiders tell me. Compromising its relationships in the region when it comes out, what it has been doing on behalf of the United States in terms of intercepting in bulk the populations of our neighbours.
You single out.
Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
Oh no, I'm just interested in the fact that you single out the United States there, Julian, and say very little about China, which, you know.
Yeah, I do single out the United States because the reality is, and I have been researching this for 20 years, the reality is, if we look at the numbers, the United States is so aggressive, so far out ahead, that it is forcing an arms race in this area, that other countries have been reluctant in comparison to go down. It is forcing it. Now there is a situation, yeah, where everyone's into the game. Australia's into the game as well. I am less concerned by the tussle between states. The United States is completely, utterly dominant in the area. I'm more concerned about what the threat is to democracy. The basic threat is we have already very powerful groups, spy agencies and the major corporations that work with them, already well connected to government, to the military, lots of money sloshing around, who have an ability to suck on the taxation system. Those well-connected, powerful groups are getting ever more powerful. They're lifting off the population. They pose a threat, a long-term threat to democratic sovereignty in the United States and more broadly.
Julian, to close, I'd like to ask you to be a realist, not an optimist. Do you ever really believe that you will stand on the red carpet of the Senate in Canberra as a representative of the people of Victoria? And if not, who will stop you? The Australian people or forces perhaps bigger than that?
Oh, interesting question. You know, in relation to unusual events happening, to me, well, I've lived many unusual events, so I have no prejudice in relation to unusual events happening. I think it would be great for the sort of quality of debate that we have in the Australian Parliament. To have me or the other candidates there would be fantastic. I'm not just talking about whether I would like to be there, but just to watch it, just to see it unfold would be a fantastic thing. If we look at who would try and stop it, Well, I guess we're going to see. You know, when the party launched, there was a massive denial of service attack on the party website. These sorts of things that happen. You know, it's there's a lot of players of different kinds. Obviously, the major parties and others who have an interest in seeing that these sorts of things don't come about. But if, for example, there's a legal attack, directly or by proxy, on me, or the Senate tries to prevent me taking my place, I think that's very interesting as well. In the work that I've done, it's not just our publications are interesting, right? In relation to Edward Snowden, it's not just what he revealed that is interesting. It is the reaction to it that also reveals a lot about who is connected to who and what sort of relationships there are in terms of power and how that flows around. So we're going to see that. In terms of the Constitution and how that runs, we're all fine there. We have that understood well. If I'm not able to take my place formally in the Australian Senate, for whatever reason, then Leslie Carnold, a very highly educated, experienced person in Victoria, is able to take my place. That's the problem.
Julian Assange, it's no small effort to see or to take on political questions at 3:30 in the morning. We're very grateful for you giving us your time from London today.
You're welcome. Thanks, Tim.
And that is the Fairfax Media Google Hangout with Julian Assange. My thanks to the 7 Australians who joined me in questioning Julian Assange today. Fairfax Media and Google will be inviting in fact has invited other senior politicians to join us for political discussions through Hangout in the run to the September 7th election. We hope you'll join us and help question our senior politicians as the election day nears. Have a good day today.